1,000 bottles of baby oil and lube. I will be reading to you the indictment of the charges levied against Sean Combs, aka P. Diddy, aka Puff Daddy, aka Love. Yes, I'm reading it for the second time because the first video got corrupted. For decades, Sean Combs, the defendant, abused, threatened, and coerced women and others around him to fulfill his sexual desires, protect his reputation, and conceal his conduct. To do so, Combs relied on the employees, resources, and influence of the multifaceted business empire that he led and controlled, creating a criminal enterprise whose members and associates engaged in and attempted to engage in, among other crimes, sex trafficking, forced labor, kidnapping, arson, bribery, and obstruction of justice. Sean Combs conducted his business headquartered at various times in Manhattan. This is important because he is being charged in the South District of Manhattan, the same district court that charged Epstein and Maxwell. So even though his homes were in Los Angeles and Miami, they are trying to keep this case in New York because it has the best prosecutors for these types of crimes. At times relevant to this indictment, the defendant engaged in persistent and pervasive pattern of abuse towards women and other individuals. This abuse was at times verbal, emotional, physical, and sexual. As part of his pattern of abuse, Combs manipulated women to participate in highly orchestrated performances of sexual activity with male commercial sex workers. At times, Combs and others acting at his direction made arrangements for women and commercial sex workers to fly to Combs' location. Combs ensured participation from the women by, among other things, obtaining and distributing narcotics to them, controlling their careers, leveraging his financial support, and threatening to cut off that financial support, also using intimidation and violence. Physical abuse by Sean Combs was recurrent and widely known. On numerous occasions from at least about 2009 and continuing for years, Combs assaulted women by, among other things, striking, punching, dragging, throwing objects at, and kicking them. These assaults were at times witnessed by others, and included is one instance at a Los Angeles hotel which was captured on video and later publicly reported, where Combs kicked, dragged, and threw a vase at a woman as she was attempting to leave. This is that video footage we saw of Sean Combs and Cassie. When a member of the hotel security staff intervened, Combs attempted to bribe the staff member to ensure silence. Combs' violence was not limited to these women. It extended to his employees and people witness to his abuse. Members of the criminal organization Combs Enterprise engaged in and attempted to engage in, among other activities, sex trafficking, forced labor, interstate transportation for purposes of prostitution, coercion, and enticement to engage in prostitution, narcotics offenses, kidnapping, arson, bribery, and obstruction of justice. This next part is very difficult to hear. Combs and other members and associates of his enterprise wielded the power and prestige of Combs' role at Combs' business to intimidate, threaten, and lure female victims into Combs' orbit, often under the pretense of romantic relationship. Combs then used force, threats of force, and coercion to cause victims to engage in extended sex acts with male commercial sex workers that Combs referred to, among other things, as freak-offs. Freak-offs were elaborate and produced sex performances that Combs arranged, directed, and masturbated during. They were often electronically recorded. In arranging these freak-offs, Combs, with the assistance of members and associates of the Combs Enterprise, transported and caused to be transported commercial sex workers across state lines and internationally. Freak-offs occurred regularly, sometimes lasted multiple days, and often involved multiple commercial sex workers. During freak-offs, Combs distributed a variety of controlled substance to the victims, in part to keep the victims obedient and compliant. Sometimes unbeknownst to the victims, Combs kept the videos he filmed of the victims engaging in sex acts with commercial sex workers. After freak-offs, Combs and the victims typically received IV fluids to recover from the physical exertion and drug use. Members and associates of the Combs Enterprise, including high-ranking supervisors, security staff, household staff, personal assistants, and other Combs business employees, facilitated the freak-offs, among other things, by booking hotel rooms for the freak-off, stocking the hotel in advance with the required freak-off supplies, including controlled substances, baby oil, lubricant, extra linens, lighting, and cleaning hotel rooms after the freak-offs to try and mitigate the room damage. They also arranged travel for victims, commercial sex workers, and Sean Combs to and from the freak-offs, resupplying Combs with requested supplies, delivering large sums of cash to Combs to pay the commercial sex workers, and scheduling the delivery of IV fluids. During the searches of Combs' residence in Miami, Florida, and Los Angeles, California, law enforcement seized various freak-off supplies, including narcotics and more than 1,000 bottles of baby oil and lubricant. Combs subjected victims to physical, emotional, and verbal abuse to cause the victims to engage in freak-offs. Combs maintained control over his victims through, among other things, physical violence, promises of career opportunities, granting and threatening to withhold financial support, and by other coercive means, including tracking their whereabouts, dictating the victim's appearance, monitoring their medical records, controlling their housing, and supplying them with controlled substances. During and separate from the freak-offs, Combs, among other things, hit, kicked, and threw objects at and dragged victims at times by their hair. During and separate from the freak-offs, Combs, among other things, hit, kicked, threw objects at, and dragged victims oftentimes by their hair. These assaults resulted in injuries that took days or weeks to heal from. Combs also threatened victims' careers and livelihoods, including if they resisted participating in the freak-offs. Victims believed that they could not resist Combs' demands without risking their financial or job security or without repercussions in the form of physical or emotional abuse. Combs also used the sensitive, embarrassing, and incriminating recordings that he made during freak-offs as collateral to ensure the continued obedience of his victims. On more than one occasion, Combs carried and brandished firearms to intimidate and threaten others, including victims of and witnesses to his abuse. Authorities seized 3 AR-15s with defaced serial numbers, as well as a drum magazine from his home. Members of the Combs enterprise helped conceal the violence and abuse by, among other things, assisting Combs in monitoring and preventing victims from leaving locations such as hotel rooms or Combs's residences. These occasions included instances in which a victim was required to remain in hiding, sometimes for several days at a time, to recover from injuries Combs inflicted, without being publicly observed. Members and associates of the Combs enterprise also assisted Combs in locating and contacting victims who attempted to flee his abuse. He is also charged on racketeering conspiracy charges, which involved multiple acts of kidnapping, multiple acts of arson, and multiple acts of bribery. He is also being charged with sex trafficking. Combs recruited, enticed, harbored, transported, and maintained a person who was then forced to engage in commercial sex acts. At least one of the victims who will likely provide testimony in this case is a member of Danity Kane, the band from Making the Band, the 2005 MTV show. And Little Rod, who was a producer who claims that Sean Combs tried to force him into unwanted sex acts with another male. This case is deeply disturbing, and a question was raised at the press conference this morning from the Post asking, okay, so the Southern District is handling this case. You also handled Epstein. What assurances do we have that Sean Combs will remain safe and see the consequences for his actions? And the district attorney said that you should draw no parallel to what Jeffrey Epstein did in prison and what Sean Combs is going to do, and that they are taking every measure they can to ensure his safety, and that he makes it to court, and that he spends his life in prison. They are also not going for remand or bail. They are trying to keep Sean Combs detained, saying that the egregiousness and the heinousness of his crimes would be more in line with somebody who would be detained until their trial and not released. More about this case and about the events that he held and who he invited to these events will be coming out. There are going to be lots of celebrities that are listed on things like the attendees for his birthday parties and who was on his yacht. So it's like Epstein all over again. We'll keep you updated when we have more, but for right now, that's what we've got.